TE Talks with Guides is a weekly podcast for lovers of history, travel, and all things Italian. Welcome back, everybody, to TE Talks, sponsored by Through Eternity Tours. I'm your host, Rob Allen, and on TE Talks, we get to talk with some of the most fascinating people who make a living out of being wonderful storytellers. We delve into what drives their passion, and it's a very interesting opportunity today to talk with Luca. And our argument is, as the Italians would say, about something that's very personal to me and something that I've always had a great fascination with, and that is the life about the Emperor Hadrian and the villa that he supposedly designed, which is outside of Rome. Ciao, Luca.
Hi everyone.
How are you?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. I was commenting before, I've noticed your beautiful home and I love the artwork that you have. And as you said, you classify Murano glass, chandelier, and also the lamp. So all the Venetian guides will be very happy to notice that. I'm sure they'll be able to pick it out. Here I have, I'm at my partner's villa, so we have 70s wallpaper galore, but the curtains are nice. This is not my home. So I want to clarify that. Anyway, first of all, Luca, why don't you tell us about how long you've been working with Through Eternity?
Well, actually, I started in 2011, so exactly 10 years ago.
My gosh.
Yeah, it's been a long time. And I have been working nonstop with TE until March the 8th, 2020, when I had my last memorable tour, like 2 days before the lockdown started, when they basically shut down the gates of the Colosseum right in our face.
Yeah, exactly. You were the one doing the group tour, and you're like, guys, they're not allowed into the Colosseum. Oh yes, I remember that quite well.
Yeah.
I do remember something. I remember very distinctly when you came in. First of all, you made a huge impression because your English is like mother tongue American English. And then you're like, oh, I've spent a year abroad in high school, whereas I've been here for 20 years. And I felt like I was speaking like a gorilla to some Italian family yesterday when I had to give a tour in Italian. But you speak very well. But beyond that, I remember specifically that you had brought a design that you had been working on because you were responsible for you didn't create, but you were able to sketch, and you can clarify that for me, the Basilica of Maxentius.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just so totally impressed by just that when you were working on that. So I absolutely wanted to have you on board. And also Caterina had recommended you, and Caterina, who we've met before in the podcast, is your cousin.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But
it was you don't really have cool
thing that I was
sorry.
Doing, no, it was a really cool thing that I was actually doing, the one of the Basilica of Maxentius. It was basically the topic of my postgraduate school thesis. You know, I had to basically reconstruct that entire part of the Velia, the hill next to the Palatine Hill, from the warehouses of imperial times all the way to the Basilica of Maxentius. And that was one of the reconstructions that I had to do. I had to basically reconstruct the basilica from the ruins, and also that colossal statue of Constantine inside of it. And that was really awesome. Yeah. I'm glad that it impressed you.
Oh, very much so. In fact, you need to go to the forum now. They've cleaned up the Palatine Hill a lot. It seems like it's a curated garden on the top, so it's fantastic. I believe they have kind of brought down, trimmed some of the trees. So when you go to the Nymphaeum from the aviaries below and you walk down, there's an Nymphaeum. There is the most spectacular view of the Basilica of Maxentius.
Yeah, I need to go back. Totally.
Yeah. So now to get down to the nitty gritty, you are an archaeologist, and I wanted to just actually start this out by telling you about my fascination with the Emperor Hadrian. I was given by a friend a piece of jewelry, because this guy made a career out of taking copies of Roman coins, and he gave this one to me, and it was of Antinous, who was the favorite of the Emperor Hadrian. He explained to me the story about Hadrian and how Hadrian, even though he was married, of course, and sexuality in the ancient world was very different, he had taken under his wing this man, Antinous, and that the story of Antinous ended up dying in the Nile, maybe by committing suicide, and that how he dedicated a city to Antinous, and he also made Antinous a god, and that he had built this spectacular villa to recreate parts of his empire. That was how it was initially told to me. And that was right before I took a backpack trip to Europe in 1996. And I was traveling to all of the great museums. And I remember that I would always find an Antinous. And even in the, Van Gogh Museum, there was even in the Amsterdam on the top floor, there was a special exhibition to Antinous at that point. So I was really curious about many of these things. I was fascinated from the beginning. And, so I read the book of Hadrian's memoirs as well when I first decided to live in Rome. And so this is like my whole precursor and one of my initial passions for why I ended up becoming a guide for the city. So what has your experience been with Hadrian? And then we could talk about him and why he is so interesting.
Well, I don't know. Anytime that I think of Hadrian and Hadrian's Villa, it brings up to me memories from my childhood when I was like 7 or 8 and I visited Hadrian's Villa for the first time. Wow. And I remember swans floating on the Canopy Canal that you don't find anymore, and how immense the whole site looked to me, even more immense, of course, when you're a little kid than what it actually is right now. And but in Rome itself, there are so many traces that Hadrian left that also later when I grew up and I studied Hadrian more in depth and everything else, I was totally fascinated by the huge, totally, incredible trace that he left in the city. The Pantheon, or the temple in Piazza di Pietra, or Castel Sant'Angelo. The mausoleum, which is another thing that brings me back, memories from my childhood when I was in elementary school and I took my first field trip. And that's, I think, the first time ever that I actually heard of Hadrian as an emperor. And I've always been fascinated by him. I think, though, that we tend to be given of Emperor Hadrian an image that is a little bit too romantic, a little bit too, idealized, because he was an extremely complex person in a lot of ways. He had an extremely complex personality, and his bright sides, I think, were equal very much by his dark sides, because he could show also a very, very vicious, attitude to a lot of things, and he acted pretty viciously in a lot of ways in his life, I think. Besides,
Yeah, you're right. And of course, when one talks about him sometimes, or I know I do, one kind of washes over certain those little dark aspects. You kind of idealize the fact, like, well, he preserved the empire by not continuing to conquer and many of those things. But he did have a temper, if I recall.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But, great people in history, if you pretty much bring them down to their human dimension, you always pretty much find that they have, very, very common aspects as well in their personality. It's totally normal. We just tend to idealize people and put them on a pedestal, especially when they have had such an incredible impact on the history of the world, like Hadrian. I mean, think of all the incredible things that he did. Not only the monuments, the constructions that he pretty much spread all over the Roman Empire, that he left in the wake of his incredible travels, but also think of what he did in Judea, with, Jerusalem. And I mean, the reason why we call, people called for a long time that part of the world Palestine is something that dates back to the time of Emperor Hadrian. And a lot of the things that are happening in the Middle East right now are also consequence of what happened in that part of the world in the time of Emperor Hadrian. And, think of the, the trace that the reforms, the reformations that Hadrian promoted throughout the empire left, as a sort of imprinting in the subsequent history of the Roman Empire after his death. I mean, there's a lot of things that Hadrian had an incredible impact on. But yeah.
That is very interesting, these points that you're making. First of all, of course, we tend to idealize people in general, and if they're in certain positions of power, either it be present or the past, we tend to forget the fact that they are human beings and that they have emotions, and that emotions are not rational by any means sometimes.
Absolutely.
And with that power, unfortunately, sometimes those impulsive moments can make decisions that could be very harsh with great consequences. I wanted to say something about Hadrian, just to give a context for people, because maybe there's some people we just assume, because as guys, every guy we all know about Hadrian. Who is Hadrian? Hadrian, let's just say it in a snapshot, and you can add on, feel free to add on. But he reigned from 117 to 138 AD, and his predecessor was the man who made the Roman Empire the largest it would ever be, the Emperor Trajan, who was also pretty well loved by the people of Rome. Now, with that, and to put that in an idea, when I was talking to Guia in our previous podcast about the Torlonia, and the way she described about the money that he had, I was like, well, he was a billionaire. The Torlonia, Alessandro Torlonia, was a billionaire. And you have to imagine that Hadrian is coming into probably what was considered, to me at least, if I've understood it correctly, the golden age of the empire, meaning it was at its wealthiest at that point when he came into power, and he was fairly rational. So he is a man who makes specific choices about the military, and also about construction, and about viewing this empire. And that's why I think, for me, and I think for many others, he's rather unique. Earlier emperors we talk about sometimes their eccentricities when we're giving tours, but here we have this man who seems, as you said, with a dark side, and we'll talk about that too, because I want to hear the nitty gritty and from your point of view. But seems magnanimous, and he seems like he's making these really bold, great choices. So would you have anything to add about that, to give people a clue about who Hadrian is if they've never known anything about him?
Well, I think that it's also interesting to talk about his earlier years, right? When he was the fact that he was born in a very, very small town in southern Spain, a town called Italica, that is very close to the much more famous Seville, in one of the most beautiful parts of Spain that actually I happened to visit in 2019, just a few months before the catastrophe hit, basically. And Italica is actually a very, very well-preserved Roman site with a very beautiful amphitheater and a lot of pretty nice homes with splendid mosaics. But it's a very small provincial town in a pretty remote part of the empire. So I was joking, no wonder both Trajan and Hadrian, that were both born in Italica, left Italica to come to Rome. But
I remember them reading in books sometimes that the Romans themselves kind of felt like, oh, who are these burini? Who are these country bumpkins that are
exactly.
with their accents? They had heavy accents.
Exactly. And basically, Hadrian finds himself in Rome totally for totally circumstantial reasons. Basically, his father was a cousin of Trajan's, that was not, of course, emperor yet. He was just a very successful general of the Roman Empire, married to this extremely fascinating and intriguing lady called Plotina, that not that many people that is not given the consideration that she actually deserves, I think. And basically Hadrian's father dies in Italica, and Hadrian is only 10. We are in the year 86 AD, and he's sent to Trajan because, by will, the father of Hadrian wanted to pretty much give the custody of his son to his cousin Trajan. And so basically Hadrian, this little burino, this provincial kid from this small provincial remote town in Spain, is sent all the way to the capital of the Roman Empire that was getting very, very close, as you were saying before, to its climax. And he finds himself in the largest metropolis of the ancient world, in which, hundreds of languages and religions and things like that were spoken by people that came from every corner of the Mediterranean. And you can imagine the huge impact that this all must have had on his personality, but also the incredible impact that his coming to Rome must have had on Plotina, the pretty unhappy and pretty melancholy wife of Trajan.
Ah, okay. Yeah. See, I don't
Yeah.
know that. I know that they had a close relationship, like I
Oh,
said.
they did. Yeah. Not a love affair, as all the evil tongues just, say. First of all, because there was a basic, reason why that was not very, very likely. That Hadrian in general didn't seem to be fascinated very much by women in general. But what I find it
Oh,
really interesting is that everybody talks about Hadrian's homosexuality, and
mhm.
nobody ever talks about Trajan's sexual orientation, which was not that different from Hadrian's.
Hmm.
But the fact that, Trajan was a very, very manly general, always living
Mhm.
in barracks, surrounded by very, very, vigorous soldiers and everything else, and the fact that he was so bold, so audacious in his military campaigns, as you were saying, doesn't, let you focus very much on this other more, intimate aspect of his personality.
Well, that's a very valid point. I mean, sexuality in the ancient world, we could do a whole topic.
Oh,
You, me, and
absolutely.
Thomas can have a whole discussion. We could do like a three-way Zoom
Yeah.
and do a podcast. I think that would be actually very valid because it is very important. I always joke around when you're saying, because Hadrian also seems to be quite, I mean, just what I've seen, that his portrait seems to be very masculine
Yeah.
figure as well. Maybe they wanted to depict him that way. I mean, but that's all I've ever heard. But I always thought his poor wife Sabina, maybe like Plotina, she always seems to have a bit of a sourpuss, like not happy face in her portrait.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And she pretty much showed her frustration and her unhappiness in several ways. But Plotina was very, very faithful to her husband. She basically followed him in all his military campaigns. So she must have been an extremely tough, very determined woman, a woman of the Roman aristocracy who had received a very, very valid education. So she was cultivated. She was very determined, and basically when little Hadrian came to Rome, she was really happy to have a kid in her household because her marriage to Trajan had been totally childless until that point. Who knows for what reason? And basically, she pretty much profused all her energies in this little kid that probably since the beginning she wanted to be the successor of Trajan. And it seems that Trajan very likely was not very much convinced that Hadrian would be fit for basically the role, even if Hadrian showed an incredible talent in every single aspect of culture, of life, basically since he was a little kid.
yes.
He had an incredible memory. He was able to pretty much learn anything and achieve, incredible results in every aspect if he just set his mind to it. So he became a writer, he became a poet, he became an artist. He was a very, very well-versed general. He was able to develop military strategies. He was really able to do anything. And he proved himself to be very, very valid in the battlefield as well with his stepfather Trajan. So
Mhm.
he was really talented in many, many different ways.
Yeah, this is very interesting because I remember that he did seem to keep him at a certain distance, and that's why the problems arise when Trajan did not make him the definitive heir
No, he
apparent
did not.
when he
Yeah,
was the
exactly.
emperor. And that created conflicts because Trajan died during his Parthian campaigns, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He was basically stationed in southern Turkey in
Mhm,
a small town called Selinus, that is,
mhm,
in what used to be called Chilicha, this region of southern Turkey, not far from Tarsus, which is another really famous town of that part of Turkey, because Tarsus was, let's not forget it, St. Paul's hometown.
yes.
And when he died, actually, Hadrian was governor of Syria, and he was stationed in Antioch in Syria. So he had pretty much he was well off in his political career as well, because let's not forget this. Hadrian becomes at 21 the official speech writer of his father.
Mm.
So the provincial little kid who barely spoke decent Latin learns Latin so well, masters the language so well, that person becomes the speechwriter of his own father. And and he basically starts his political career covering offices that are more and more important, and becoming governor of Syria back then was a pretty big deal. So he was in Syria when Trajan basically gets really sick and he's about to die. And all the way to the end, in his deathbed, it seems that Trajan didn't actually say anything about appointing Hadrian as his successor. And that's when Plotina comes back into, the whole thing, because some historians believe that she might have been the one that made the succession possible by basically sending the other tutor of of the future Emperor Hadrian, this man that was one of the most faithful men that she had at that point, into the dark room in which Trajan probably was already dead, and how this man basically sneaked into the deathbed near the dead body of Trajan and pretending to be Trajan, basically dying with a fake broken voice, basically said that he was appointing his son Hadrian as the successor to the throne of the Roman Empire.
Wow.
And at that point, when the letters were sent from southern Turkey, from southern Asia Minor, as it was called back then, to Rome, to the Roman Senate, to basically ratify the adoption and the appointment of Hadrian as the new emperor, all those letters, weirdly enough, were not signed by Trajan, but they were signed by Plotina, which was totally against the procedure, the legal procedure.
And so there was a scandal ensued, and the Senate did not want to accept this, right?
Yeah, but Plotina was so determined that, as usual, she was able to get what she wanted. And Hadrian basically came back to Rome as the new emperor. Keep in mind that before this happened, you were mentioning Sabina, the very unhappy wife of Emperor Hadrian. Sabina was a cousin of Hadrian's. Basically, she was the daughter of Matidia, that, if I'm not wrong, was the sister of Emperor Trajan. So basically, he married a cousin of his, which was pretty normal, back then in the aristocratic families. But Plotina was an extremely intelligent woman and realized that for Hadrian, especially in the perspective of becoming the new emperor, it was extremely important to have a close bond with the imperial family, where, by marrying a member of the aristocracy in Rome, marrying someone that was linked to Emperor Trajan.
Of course, it was a very important thing.
And also, in spite of the fact that he really didn't want to marry, because of the fact that he was just not interested in it. It was extremely important in Roman society to keep what we call the honor matrimoni, the honor of matrimony. It was absolutely inconceivable for a man, especially of that position, of that social position, not to marry a very, very prominent member of the aristocracy. So I don't like to make parallels, but it was really something like the wedding of Charles and Diana. And basically, Plotina forced her son Hadrian to give the Romans everything that, the Romans expected of the man he had chosen would be the new emperor.
It's fascinating. I'm going to give a little plug in here, because that's another point about the podcast. But the way you specifically talk about Plotina and Sabina, Grayson has done a very interesting virtual tour about the women of Rome, of ancient Rome. She even does it into 2 parts. But it's just amazing to think, then, the way you've painted this beautifully is that it is the choice and the power and the cunning of Plotina that Hadrian became the emperor, which we've already discussed has been greatly influential in the history of the world from that point. So that's amazing. It's amazing. So yeah, he becomes emperor. Now he also has these problems, and he ends up, some of his supporters killed a couple of senators, I think, if I recall.
Well, there is also a conspiracy orchestrated by one of the closest generals to Emperor Trajan at the beginning of his rule. So things start in a pretty messy way.
Yeah.
I mean, as usual, transition to power, especially at the peak of the empire, is never smooth. There is always something that happens.
Gosh, it's so amazing to think about this stuff. And we always talk about it as in something that happened so many years ago, and then it doesn't happen now. But I'm finding on the very few tours that I'm starting to do, I have to be very careful of how I speak. But you think about, there was a riot that almost seemed to be a coup that was going on January 6th of this year on Capitol Hill. And, these kinds of things about the Senate being threatened, that they were running out of the Senate, the chambers of the Senate, the risking of their lives because there were people banging on the doors. And there's always an amazing thing, I think, of guides, and I talk about that with some people, is that we know history very well, and we know that history repeats itself. You know, it's not the same exact thing, but we see that these things are not things that have never happened before. They have happened.
Yeah.
They have happened definitely in the past. So now we have it. He's established as emperor. And one thing that I've always been intrigued by is that he takes the project of building this villa. This is not just one property that he had. Many aristocratic Romans who were very wealthy had several kinds of properties that they would make. He was building this, taking on from a house that belonged to his wife's family, right? It's a Republican villa was the initial base of the operations of where they built Hadrian's villa. He starts this project, and then it goes back and forth of him working on it and then traveling
Yes,
throughout
exactly.
the empire.
Exactly. Yeah, the point of Hadrian's travels, that is one of the things that people always talk about the most, is that he had an approach to the administration of the huge empire that he had inherited that was totally different from the one that all his predecessors and also his successors ever had. First of all, as you were saying before, he realized that it was impossible to keep the empire in the extension that his father had pretty much brought it to, unless he wanted to keep it in a constant state of extremely expensive warfare, which is one of the reasons why he decided to renounce to some of those lands that were too far to be kept, and on which steady Roman control was absolutely impossible. People, places like Armenia, regions like, Mesopotamia, that corresponds more or less to modern Iraq, that had been actually taken away from the Parthians, were basically abandoned by the troops. He just withdrew the troops from there because it was impossible to keep them. And he insisted, on the other hand, on reinforcing the borders of the Roman Empire. And that is one of the reasons why he traveled as well, because basically he decided to reinforce the border along the Danube, along the Rhine, all the way up to Roman England. The famous wall, Hadrian's Wall, that we always talk about. Those are all basically huge architectural projects of defense that he basically probably helped plan. There is a lot of historians that believe that he participated to the planning of Hadrian's Wall, for example.
Yeah, if I recall, I remember studying about this, that the idea was that he wanted to keep an active army as well, that he didn't want to have the army inactive, which would make it dangerously putting the empire at risk, but to have the troops continuously train and work and fortify and control the borders.
Exactly. I think that he also increased the number of legions. He did a lot of things in that. He changed also a lot of the heads. In a lot of crucial commanding positions, because he wanted to pretty much put more people that would be more faithful to him and replace the ones who were actually faithful to his father Trajan, which of course always kept on organizing conspiracies in the back, which was always extremely dangerous. And he did a lot of things, but traveling was also for him a way to understand and know the empire better, and understand how every different province, every different territory needed to be dealt with in a different way, according to the specific characteristics of the people that were living in that region, according to the geography of that region, according to the culture and to the traditions of that particular region. He had a conception of the Roman Empire as a sort of faceted entity that was pretty much made of many things that were all basically living together, that no other emperor had before, or will ever have later. So that is really unique, for example, of his approach.
Yeah, it makes me think. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just saying, it makes me think about how you were discussing about how he, even as a young boy of 10, was very capable of remembering and learning, and that he must have had this rapacious desire to gather and get information. And of course, by doing that, by learning it and traveling, even if, of course, he was traveling with an entourage as an emperor would,
of course.
But he did take that interest in learning about the cultures, or learning about the people wherever he went within this vast empire. And yeah, many people did not do that previously or after him.
Absolutely. Yeah, he spent most of his time traveling basically, because I think that the first trip started, I think around 120 or so, like a couple of years after he became emperor.
Mhm.
And the first one actually took him to Northern Europe,
Mhm.
because he went up all the way to England, where he basically supervised the beginning of the construction of the wall.
Sure.
And then he went back down to France, where he visited several cities. And of course, he left trace of himself there. For example, in Nîmes, the very, very beautiful Nîmes in France, he
Mhm.
had a temple built in honor of his mother, Plotina, for example. And then he went all the way down to Spain, probably also passed through Italica, his hometown. And
Mhm.
then from Spain through the Gibraltar Strait all the way to North Africa. And
Mhm.
then, of course, to Egypt. And from there, he also stopped in Judea. That's when he went to Jerusalem, that had been destroyed by Titus and Vespasian, basically 50 years before.
Mhm.
And he pretty much showed the intention of founding on the ruins of Jerusalem a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, and built on the basically the platform of the old Jewish temple of Jerusalem, a new temple dedicated to Jupiter Capitolinus, which was totally, of course, outrageous to the Jews.
The
And
Jewish.
that is, yeah, and basically that's what triggered the third Jewish revolt against Rome, that of course was ferociously repressed. That was probably the only time in which Hadrian showed this ferocious, repressive, side of himself, because he always tried to keep things peaceful as much as possible.
Mhm.
And basically, Jerusalem was rebuilt as Aelia Capitolina, so even the name was changed. Jews were basically forbidden from living in there. So basically, new Roman colonizers were installed in the new founded town. And even administrative autonomy was stripped off from the province of Judea, which was totally suppressed, and incorporated into the province of Syria. And the name of the new province became Syria Palestina. That's when the name Palestine started to be attached to that part of the world, basically. So even the
Fascinating.
name of Judea was pretty much taken away. Everything that was vaguely Jewish was basically eradicated totally from that land. And think of the huge impact that that had in the following centuries, and that still has in that part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about over 2,000 years ago, there was this attempt. We would think, as we've said, we put him out to be this great picture, and it's so idealized to think that he, when he deals with his subjects of the empire, that he has a way to visually see and connect with people, and even because, of course, with his power, he could make great changes to help people out. And so that he just basically dropped the ball with this. He misunderstood the population of Judea and the religion and the race, obviously, and butted heads with them and created this horrific kind of a situation, which is indeed very dark. Uh,
Yeah, exactly. But
mm,
the whole thing was pretty much, yeah, his mindset, his mentality was so deeply Roman that everything that basically had to do with that was totally out of his conception. For example, a lot of people don't remember that, but he had a temple of Aphrodite and a statue of Aphrodite built right on the spot of the Golgotha where Jesus had been crucified. So he must have been also familiar with the fact that that part of the outside of Jerusalem was actually very, very important to the early Christians, that in that part of the Middle East were probably already emerging as a community. And he showed a pretty distinctive hostility to the early Christians as well by doing that. It'll be a century and a half later that Empress Helena, the
mhm.
mother of Constantine, will take away the statue of Aphrodite, the temple, dig back the whole place and find the Holy Sepulchre, and start the construction of the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. But that's a totally different story.
Wow,
But
that's
in the
amazing.
time of Helena, there was still on the spot of the Golgotha, on the spot of the crucifixion of Jesus, a statue of Aphrodite that had been established there by Emperor Hadrian.
Oh my God, you get back. Let's just get rid of this. Do you
Yeah,
imagine?
exactly.
I mean,
Yeah,
the idea of that, and it's so funny because we don't really talk about that. In fact, when we give a context, it's like we talk about that Vespasian and Titus were
yeah,
responsible for conquering Judea or dealing with the oppressions and the diaspora, but
yeah.
it was also Hadrian was
Oh,
absolutely.
absolutely. Hadrian did a, yeah, Hadrian was not very, very nice to the Jews in a lot of ways either.
I guess he got
Absolutely.
a little away with it because people don't tend to talk about that with him, unfortunately. But now they will because we're talking
Yeah.
about it on the podcast.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, he was totally into Greek culture, philosophy, and all these things. Don't forget that Emperor Hadrian is the first emperor to actually grow a beard as
Yes.
a symbol of his philosophical inspiration. Because if you look at ancient statuary,
Hmm.
Greek and Roman, the ones that always have a long beard, long or short, it depends, are always the philosophers. If you take a
Hmm.
look at the busts of all the ancient philosophers in every museum of antiquity in the whole world, they are always bearded faces.
Hmm.
That was a distinctive sign, sign of philosophers, especially in Greece.
Wasn't that also though because then he decided to have the beard that it set the trend for him, the emperor, and
Oh,
then many
absolutely.
people absolutely had beards until Constantine, I think, who
Exactly.
couldn't grow
Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius and all the others that came later, they all grow long beards and they all try to show somehow this philosophical side. Well, Marcus Aurelius is probably the one that succeeded in this the most, but also the others did something
one.
like this, if you look at it that way.
So yeah, at least then you're going to have to put on this idea that you are well educated, that you can philosophize, as opposed to being interested in performing in plays like Nero or Caligula and all
Yeah.
those other eccentricities. Interesting. Now, can I ask you, just because, of course, for me, the fantasy, a lot of it has to deal with the book, Hadrian's
Mhm.
Memoirs. You have, of course, read the book by
Yeah. Yeah.
Joseph.
Yeah. A long time ago when I was in high school.
Oh my God, I can't believe you read it.
Yeah.
I was like
It was
25 when I
one of
was.
the high school readings that we had to do.
Oh, so it was obligatory. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Did you like the book or did you like
I liked it. Yeah, it tends to give, a very, very, I don't know, somehow romanticized, slightly idealized vision of the emperor,
Mhm.
but I like the fact that it tries to somehow penetrate his personality and give us a more
Mhm.
in-depth insight about Emperor Hadrian. It's very, very poetic. I remember especially the last words of the book, something like, let's say farewell to the things that we'll never see again. Let's
Mhm.
try to enter death with open eyes or something like that.
Yeah, I remember also she quoted. I mean, it's for me. It's also fascinating because the writer Marguerite Yourcenar was, if I'm not mangling the last name for pronunciation, she's from Belgium. She was the first woman accepted into the Academy of the Sorbonne of the
Mhm.
classics studies. She also was a very difficult person. She had a very difficult life herself and was lesbian and had great challenges, and that the book took an enormous amount of time in her life, and that she was going to Hadrian's villa itself and would be there to be inspired and would be writing in her book, going around in those kinds of ruins, and that's what made it so keen for me to go and check out. To go to it. In fact, they even called the piazza in front of the entrance of the ruins the Piazza di Margherita.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Mm-mm. So yeah, there is that kind of, as you said, the idealized. Now you do also get hints of stuff. We talk about how Hadrian had the architect of Trajan, Apollodorus of Damascus, executed when they had
Yeah,
fights
yeah,
over
exactly.
pumpkins and domes.
Yeah, which is another pretty dark side of himself. I can understand the joke about the pumpkins that Apollodorus of Damascus must have made probably for real, because if you look at a lot of the domes that Hadrian designed in Hadrian's villa, they honestly kind of look like pumpkins, especially the one in the Canopus, you know
Mm-hmm.
a little bit. Yeah, the anecdote is that basically when Apollodorus of Damascus was planning the markets of Trajan and Trajan's forum, and he was pretty much going over the architectural plans with Trajan, and young Hadrian would every once in a while step into the room and look over at the projects and try to say order something, and he would always be dismissed very bluntly by Apollodorus of Damascus, who would just tell him, you just go back, draw your pumpkins, and leave us in peace. That's what, yeah, he apparently said. So probably when when Hadrian became emperor, he was able to take his revenge and all the contempt that basically Apollodorus must have showed to him, even if probably he used Apollodorus in a lot of projects. I mean, a lot of historians believe that the Pantheon, which is one of the most incredible architectural projects ever made in the history, not only of Roman architecture, but I think of universal architecture. And in the time of Emperor Hadrian, we don't know the name of the architect, but a lot of historians believe that very likely the architect was Apollodorus himself. So,
No others say.
and my personal opinion as an archaeologist is that probably we have to think of Apollodorus also for the mausoleum of Emperor Hadrian. Probably most of that was planned by Hadrian himself, but nobody will ever take away from my mind that probably Apollodorus had to deal with that as well.
And so, of course, he's being executed, so he doesn't get the credit for it.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Was he also then, he was involved, of course, with the column of Trajan then, Apollodorus of Damascus?
Yeah, of course, because, you know, the column of Trajan was part of the complex of the Forum and the Marcus of Trajan. You know, it was basically in this very, very short, very small courtyard between the Latin and the Greek library of the Forum of Trajan, in front of the Basilica of the Forum of Trajan. And on the other side, there was the temple of Trajan himself that should pretty much lie at, of course, foundation level under Palazzo Valentini. So yeah, but that's a totally different story. Yeah, and Trajan's column, was we didn't know the name of the sculptors, of the artists, of the workshop that actually did it, but yeah, it's part of the complex that was actually designed by Apollodorus of Damascus, one of the greatest architects of antiquity, I think.
Yeah, because we don't know a lot of the names of the people, but the few that we know.
We don't know the name of the architect or of the architects of the Colosseum, to just give you an example, but we know the name of this incredible person.
Yes, exactly. And I'm glad that you bring up the Colosseum, because you do have that wonderful tour of the Colosseum, which I'm going to mention, you know, the virtual tour of the Colosseum, which for me is fantastic. It was it blew my mind when you did it. I think it's outstanding as a virtual tour, with the visuals that you create and the details that you always have. I mean, anyone who's listening in can tell that you have an enormous amount of very specific details that helps to create a picture for people in a wonderful way, because it's very easy and flowing too. What I was going to say is, let's get back to the villa itself. I personally, going to the villa, find it to be stunningly beautiful. We go up through the hill, through an olive grove. Usually you go when the weather is nice. You can see Tivoli up in the hills in the background, and it's on some plateaus. But as a guide, because maybe it's because we don't get to go to it often, I find it to be challenging to show people. Plus the fact is that, you know, the theory is that Hadrian was, you know, an aspiring architect, and that this was his kind of playground to make experiments and to give people an idea. I always say it's like the Versailles of ancient Rome, or it is a vast city unto itself. You know, what territory there is of it, that we haven't even seen all of it, but there is a model of it. I mean, how do you feel about going there? Do you enjoy Hadrian's Villa?
I totally enjoy Hadrian's Villa. I wish I could go there actually a lot more than what what we actually do. And I find it extremely challenging as well, because basically you have to present an entire universe in just the little time that you've got available. Especially you have to do it walking through as much as possible of an immense site that is really hard to cover. Not only because there is always some restoration works here and there, and so some parts are accessible, others are accessible, but also when I had to design an itinerary that would actually satisfy my what I thought would be enough for people to get an idea of it, took me a long time as well. But yeah.
Do you know that with the COVID procedures, because I did end up going there last summer, they've done, it's insane, because, you know, I always love to start at, well, of course, when you go into the main, the name is, of course, the walking courtyard.
The Pecile.
See, thank you, the Pecile. And then I would eventually do the entire itinerary to finish at the Canopus. Well, they make you start at the Canopus and go backwards. That's what they make you do with Hadrian's Villa, which of course is not, you know, the Canopus itself is one of those most.
Yeah, that's one of the, it's like the climax that you try to end with, but
And on a big note, and on a big note.
yeah.
Do you believe the argument, though, that he has used this area to be placed, to create reminders of the empire through his journeys? Because it was built in like three building phases in between his
Yeah, two or three. Yeah, there's a big debate about that. We know that construction started right after he became emperor in 118, 120. So we have to think that probably Hadrian had been thinking of this incredibly magnificent residence for some time before he became emperor, which really tells us also a lot about his intentions and about his dreams and his fantasies, I think. And I do believe that, sure, every part of the villa somehow was pretty much named after a very remarkable part of the Roman Empire that he had visited, even if, of course, that didn't mean that the part of the villa somehow recreated this particular area or this particular thing of the Roman Empire that he had visited faithfully. It was only a way to evoke the memory of it, basically. So, for example, the Pecile was this huge, immense open courtyard that was somehow there to recall the memory of this really famous portico in the Stoa in the Agora in Athens.
Yes.
Portico that was called Stoa Poikiles, which was very, very famous for the beautiful paintings hanging in it. And when I went to the Agora a couple of years ago, I was so depressed because basically of the Stoa Poikiles, all that remains is only the foundations, and part of the foundations are actually ruined by the modern railway of the modern transportation of Athens passing by.
Oh my
It was
God.
extremely depressing. Like, so this is all that remains of the Stoa Poikiles that inspired the Pecile in Hadrian's Villa. How depressing.
Yeah, I remember I've been to the Agora. I mean, I don't even think we could enter in it. I had to, I mean, I
Oh,
was,
well, you can enter it, but there is so little to see. There is so little left of the Agora that, yeah, I mean, compared to the Roman Forum, it's really hard to get an idea, even if you are very much versed and you've studied a lot about that, because there's really nothing left. And or for example, the Tempe Valley, which was this beautiful valley that pretty much extended northeast, I think, of the villa, which was there to recall the Tempe Valley, northern Greece, which was the place in which, according to mythology, the wife of Orpheus had been, bitten by the snake and she had died. And then Orpheus had taken this journey to the netherworld to get her back. But the pact was that he was not supposed to turn around on the way out of the netherworld. He did. And so he lost his wife forever. And that was another really beautiful story to tell, a very, very evocative part. Or there was another section, the Academy, that was, of course, there to recall the Academy founded by Plato, the most prominent Greek philosopher in Athens. And that was a very, very remote part of Hadrian's villa. It was pretty much far off from the campus. And guess who was supposed to go move into the Academy in this so far away off the beaten path place of Hadrian's villa?
I have no idea.
Sabina, of course, his wife.
Oh, poor Sabina.
But she never did. She never did because the academy was basically ready only in 135, and I think that by that time Sabina was already really sick, and she died a year and a half later.
My gosh.
So yeah, so this historian says basically the academy remained as a beautiful empty shell in which nobody ever lived.
Oh gosh, and we don't go there. It's not
No,
open.
you cannot go there. It's closed to the public. But the academy, for example, is that part of Hadrian's Villa from which beautiful art, was discovered. Like, for example, that beautiful mosaic in Opus Vermiculatum in the Capitoline Museum, showing you the birds drinking. Yeah, exactly. That comes from the academy.
Oh, that comes from the academy. I did not realize that. I remember
from the academy.
That's a great point that you point out, is that we have to let people understand that the villa itself was filled with so many beautiful artistic treasures that are not just all over in Rome and in the Capitoline museums. There's pieces.
But they're like spread all over the museums of the world.
Exactly, spread. I mean, I always said if any museum is worth its salt and it has an ancient Roman collection, it will have pieces from Hadrian's Villa. In fact, what area, which is referred to as the Piazza d'Oro, was because there were so many treasures that were also found there in these portico. I mean,
hundreds of statues all over.
Yeah, simply outstanding. It would be nice if we could have better visuals for them when we are there, because you do feel that you are very much an archaeological
That's
site.
what I try to do. In fact, I always bring with me pictures of some of these very, very beautiful statues and things like that. And I try to show them to my clients as I'm visiting the different parts and the ruins, just to let them pretty much picture them. And if I happen to take them to other Roman museums in which there is stuff from Hadrian's Villa, I try to pretty much make the connection between the place in Hadrian's Villa where we saw that and the particular statue. The Vatican museums, for example, are filled with statues coming from Hadrian's Villa. And what really tells you a lot about the great respect and love that Hadrian had for Greek art is the fact that in Hadrian's Villa, you find a lot of copies of Greek art, a lot of copies of the most famous masterpieces of Greek art. For example, the discus thrower by Myron,
Mhm.
a copy of which was found in Hadrian's Villa, and it's now in the Vatican museums in the same neoclassical rotunda where there is the chariot in the middle.
Ah,
That
yeah.
yeah, that beautiful discus thrower that is one of the best copies of Myron's lost original in bronze comes from Hadrian's Villa. Or another statue by Myron, this great Greek sculpture,
Mhm.
the cow in bronze that he made and that was in Rome. There
Mhm.
is a copy also in the Vatican museums in the Gallery of the Animals. You can actually see entering the gallery to the left. That also comes from Hadrian's Villa.
God, I didn't
Also,
think
this
of
beautiful
that.
red marble deer head or this beautiful peacock, they all come from Hadrian's Villa.
Oh my gosh. I
Yeah,
remember there's a centaur that is in the Capitoline Museums. That's made of oh God, it's a red antique red
exactly.
marble.
Yeah, that one also
Outstanding.
comes from Hadrian's Villa.
Yeah.
I don't remember if, for example, that comes from the so-called Maritime Theater, which was actually one of the first things to be built of the villa and one of the most unusual
Mhm.
architectural features of the villa. This sort of round, very, very beautiful and very, very
Mhm.
posh residential area surrounded by a moat that was actually a sort of swimming pool, according to the most recent interpretations,
Oh,
and connected to the rest of the villa thanks to a bridge. And basically, this sort of pied à terre, as we can call it in French, was a residence that was planned according to the most traditional rules of Roman domestic architecture. And basically, you had the atrium, you had the peristyle, and then you had the cubicola, the bedrooms, and there was also a small bath in it.
yes, I always thought that was indicative, the fact that there was a toilet area for one person, that it was the emperor. In fact, they said that, wasn't it, that when he was in a moment where he did not want to be disturbed because his mind was going like this, that he would communicate to people that he was going to spend time there and you did not want to bother him when he was at the Maritime Theater.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But that's where the place where we have to imagine him living as the whole villa was being developed and built all around him in the first years, especially.
Oh my gosh, that's fascinating. Yeah, because he wanted to be involved in the project as well.
Exactly, exactly. Well, he probably designed most of it. I mean, the plan of Hadrian's Villa is so unusual, so unheard of in the
Mhm.
history of Roman architecture. I mean, something comparable can only be really Nero's Domus Aurea. That is the only
Mhm.
thing that we can really compare to Hadrian's Villa, with the difference that Hadrian at least had the decency of building something like that out of town and not in the heart of town, taking 25% of town to build it, and
Yeah.
maybe setting the whole city on fire in order to make room and build it. So that's the big difference between the two of them.
I know it's amazing to think is that we have about an hour and a half to get up the hill, give people an explanation of Hadrian, get through to see something that is like the size of the forum itself. I mean, that there was an amphitheater, there was regular theaters, there was just so much there. There were also places, the storerooms, where the bodyguards of the emperor stayed, or where everyone else stayed.
And the baths, there were
The
like baths
baths.
for the staff, and there were baths for the slaves even, and then there was like a private bath for the emperor himself, one of
Mhm.
the first to be built, in which there was a beautiful statue of this crouching Venus by Doidalsas, another great Greek art,
Mhm.
sculpture, and the original, which is now in the Museo Nazionale Romano. You can go see it.
Mhm. And I mean, for me also, what's so amazing is that it's such a massive place. But I always love to talk about the connections of things and how influential it was. For a long time, people used to think that it was the ancient city of Tivoli, and when Piero Ligurio was going on as an antiquarian to kind of find statues to fill up for his boss, Ippolito d'Este, who's building up his sumptuous villa up on the hill in Tivoli. He kind of realizes, no, this is not the ancient city of Tivoli itself. It's Hadrian's villa, and with all the waterworks, because it was filled with massive fountains, it was connected to aqueducts, that this in turn inspired him when he was designing all those beautiful fountains in Villa d'Este, and then even Guia was pointing out to me that, and I did not associate this, but of course it makes perfect sense that Villa Borghese and Villa Torlonia, which we were talking about, were these kind of playground areas with very different spaces, with one building for a certain purpose, but then other buildings for other purposes. And that Hadrian's Villa was the inspiration for all of this.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another huge imprinting that basically Hadrian gave to another thing in the course of history, if you look at it that way. How inspirational he was able to be in so many different ways, even if not all the choices they left in history were very positive. I mean, think of what we were talking about before.
With Palestine. Oh, that.
But yeah, the whole villa, the fact that you had, an entire section that was for winter, another section that was for summer, and the orientation of these two sections was, of course, the summer one facing the north to be the, very, very cool as much as possible, and the one used in winter having all the, radiant heating systems underneath the floors, and with this big windows facing the south and the southwest, so that to pretty much enjoy the sun exposure as much as possible. And all these huge reception halls with statues and the decorative things that were pretty much carefully studied and designed to pretty much evoke different images according to where you were and everything else. You were talking about the canopus before. The canopus is one of the most intriguing and also one of the most enigmatic parts of Hadrian's Villa. Sure. Because, canopus was the name of this big canal of the Nile connecting Alexandria to Canopus, which is this, town in Egypt, Nile Delta. But in reality, probably there is not just a connection to Egypt. If you go to the Vatican museums, for example, you'll find in the Egyptian section a huge set of beautiful Egyptian-style statues coming from the canopus that has been very recently reorganized and reconstructed according to what it must have been in the canopus.
Oh,
yeah, that huge face that you can see pretty much in white marble of a goddess. Yeah, that is that probably was at the end of the tunnel that you can see pretty much in the canopus. See, there is the big exedra, the big apse, and you can see that there was a sort of tunnel which was actually a canal of water. There was a waterfall in the background, and then there was water flowing. Basically this huge face was right at the end, and she was pretty much supposed to symbolize the beginning of the floods of the Nile. Wow. And the tunnel itself was probably supposed to be the Nile itself. And the statues that you can see in the Vatican Museum show you a scene in which basically some priests and also a priestess are reawakening early in the morning the statue of a god, the god of the Nile. And there is all these statues witnessing the reawakening of the god of the Nile, which are also Egyptian gods. And so basically the canopus itself, according to this most recent interpretation, should actually be the Mediterranean Sea and not the Nile. And that explains why, remember, on the other side of the canopus from the exedra with all this Egyptian style statue, you don't have Egyptian statues, but you've got Greek statues. The Amazons, or the statues of Hermes, the Greek god the Romans called Mercury. Some people believe that that might be a representation of Egypt on the southern side, the Mediterranean, and what is just north of Egypt from the Mediterranean, Greece.
Of course. This is see, that's what's amazing about with archaeology, with these new theories that are quite exciting to read about, to study about, and to be able to share with people coming into this area.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to wrap up that with Hadrian's Villa, there is so much someone could talk about. I mean, just on the villa itself, I mean, we could just even take like the whole group of the TE guides and we could probably
Absolutely.
share stuff with each other, what we've all learned about it, what we know about it, and that the place itself is just visually stunning, so beautiful. I always think of it as an area that even when things were very, very busy in the city, it's not easy to get to. In fact, when I tried to go there by public transport, when I didn't speak Italian, I got lost 3 times because every kind of community around there was called Villa Adriana, and I kept on getting off the bus at the wrong time. So it's not easy to get to, and it's still quite empty. I think when
Mhm.
people get to go there, and I always love that idea. I think it reminds me of feeling like, Lord Byron or somebody getting there during the grand tour of the place that's still this idea of being in ruins and not to modernize by any way. And it's just a wonderful area. And thank you very much, Luca, for sharing this stuff with us. I have just 2 questions to ask you, just as a curiosity. Who is your favorite emperor to talk about?
I don't know. I have a special fascination for Vespasian.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought that he was the one who had in mind the interest of his people in the best way, even better than Hadrian in a lot of ways. And he was maybe more linear and less twisted in personality, which makes him more human to my face, more predictable and so more reassuring.
hmm Oh, I think we forgot to mention that you, as an archaeologist, your specialty is in actuality, you are an Egyptologist,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, that's what I pretty much studied in college. I studied archaeology of the Near East and Egyptology, but then I did all my internship, all my practical experience on site in Roman excavation for 5 years. Actually, for 7 years, I worked in the big excavation that the University of Rome used to have on the northern slopes of the Palatine Hill. So we helped unearth some of the earliest traces of Rome, dating back to the foundation of the city itself. And
Fascinating.
that's yeah, and that pretty much that explains the great fascination that I have for Roman and classical archaeology in general as well.
Amazing. If I recall, you have worked in archaeological digs in Egypt because the
Yes.
last time you went, you said that it was getting so dangerous there that you
Yeah, yeah.
guys
It
were
was
all
right
running for
after
your lives.
yeah, it was right after the Arab Spring in Egypt. And so we were there in 2012 and we found the country very much changed from the last time that we had been there. People felt more free, but there was also a sense of upcoming instability that was getting a little bit disturbing. And so at some point things started getting kind of messy and we decided to pretty much leave from the night before to the morning after, and I haven't been back in Egypt ever since, and that totally broke my heart.
I would imagine that things may have been stabilized a bit. What let's see, maybe they'll.
Yeah, we were planning actually a trip to Egypt. I'd really like to go back, especially now that things are a little bit more settled down and
Mhm.
it's also less expensive.
Oh yeah, that would be great. I would like to go with you to Egypt. That would be kind of amazing. I would.
I have to brush up a few things and study a few things back before I go because I want to know my stuff when I go there. I want to have my homework done by the time that I get back to Egypt.
Oh gosh, God. I mean, I have never been to Egypt, and I desperately want to go. Now, having said that, I do always like to ask everybody who does the podcast with us that this, let's say, it's our section of TE travel tips. It's lovely to pick the brains of you guys for your experience. What would you say is an opportunity? What would you like to recommend as a tip to people who are traveling, coming to Italy?
Well, I would recommend them to take a couple of days if they really have the chance
Mhm,
to get a little bit off away from Rome after
mhm,
they have seen Rome and go see some sites in the mountains in central Italy. You don't need to really go very, very far. Even if you get as far as Subiaco and
mm,
places like that, you
that's
can see
amazing.
incredible, beautiful places. Go see the monastery built right by the cave where Saint Benedict lived as a hermit, or go have lunch in one of those incredible trattorias that you can find there, where you can really get the local food and wine and go there and just sit in a wood and hear the Aniene River murmur in the valley down below, and it's absolutely wonderful. And you can find incredibly beautiful naturalistic places, and you really don't need to go that far.
You
And
are.
that is something that nobody would ever expect about, the surroundings of Rome.
That's so true. And, we had to, because we had to learn about them for our exams. I remember I got into a car with my mom and dad, and we went to Subiaco because I really wanted to go and see
Yeah.
it, because it's one thing of reading it, but if you go and see those places, and it is truly amazing. And the fact is that all around Rome itself, outside of Lazio, we're doing these TE destination series, and there are 16 of them, and a lot of them are out. In fact, that's why it's so exciting, because today we're talking about Hadrian's Villa, because this week we're going to be uploading our newest video, which will be Hadrian's Villa, Villa Gregoriana, and Villa d'Este. So it's really exciting to see what is outside of the city and what it has to offer. So it's a very valid point. Not even that, which is one of the most famous. These are some of the most famous villas. But as you said, Subiaco is amazing. Even when Italy is going to be filled with tourists, people don't go to these sites.
Oh, absolutely. And people don't know that you might bump into people you would never imagine that you could bump into in places like that. For example, Subiaco is the hometown to two really famous ladies. Lucrezia Borgia, for one thing, was born in Subiaco, and one of the most famous actresses in Italy in the 20th century, Gina Lollobrigida. She was born in Subiaco.
Oh, really? Gina Lollobrigida?
Yeah, she's from Subiaco, Gina Lollobrigida.
And she's still alive today, isn't she?
Yeah. She lives in her beautiful mansion along the Appian Way. Yeah, of course, always wearing wigs, but she's always splendid. Totally.
Oh, yeah, she does. Yeah, she's very clear of mind. I have a very funny story to tell you about that. My mother's did not want to be called Nana or Grandma when she became a grandmother. And there used to be a joke, because a news reporter said to Gina Lollobrigida, Gina, you're going to be a grandmother now. Are they going to be calling you Nonna? And she said, no, they can call me Gina. And so my nieces, we have 3 of them, they all call my mother Gina, because of
Gina. Oh, really?
Yeah, that's cool. Even Andrea, my partner, he calls my mom Gina. He's like, Gina. So it's just like, it's become this like beautiful, sweet name of affection for people that she really cares about. So I always love it, the fact that Andrea decided to call her Gina as well. So it's really, really kind of special. So thank you again so much, Luca. This was really wonderful. And I am going to talk to you some point on a podcast that we're going to be doing. So I'm warning you now about circular mausoleums, because you and I already started to chat about that, imperial circular mausoleums in Rome, and then the obelisks, because you really know your stuff about the obelisks, where I know the surface. So I'm going to scratch down to get deeper into that.
And we are going to talk again about Emperor Hadrian, because one of the obelisks of Rome actually comes from there.
Of course. Absolutely. And it was connected to Antinous, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. Yeah. We didn't touch very much Antinous, but Antinous is so predictable when you talk about Emperor Hadrian. We try to cover other aspects of Emperor Hadrian that are less predictable, something, more unexpected to talk about him.
Yeah, and actually, you're right. I did want to ask one question, though, because they kind of uncovered this temple of Antinous in Hadrian's Villa. That stuff has been recently excavated.
Yeah, recently excavated, and it's really hard to get a feeling of what it is, because the remains are so so badly preserved. There is only like some foundations, and anytime that I point out where the Antinoion, the prison mausoleum of Emperor Hadrian is, to my clients, they basically have a hard time understanding what I'm talking about. So I try to show them some reconstructions. But yeah, there is this area immediately outside of Emperor Hadrian's Villa that for a long time was believed to be just a monumental nymphaeum, a monumental fountain. Looking closer at it, they are realizing that probably that was the sort of funerary monument. And whose funerary monument could it be? The great love of Emperor Hadrian, Antinous, this boy that drowned in the Nile very mysteriously, talking about cold cases in 130 AD at the age of 20.
Well, you know what? Well, of course, what my question is was Sabina dead by that time, or was she alive?
No, she was alive. She was alive.
Oh, God, could you imagine? Because remember, the fact that he made this person a god who was not of the imperial family was quite.
He actually did it following an extremely ancient Egyptian tradition that dates back to, the time of the pharaohs, that anybody that died in the Nile, running in the Nile, became automatically a god according to the Egyptian religion. So I believe that he actually did it in the wake of this extremely ancient Egyptian religious tradition.
Fascinating.
And all the statues that we see everywhere, including the ones in the Vatican Museum, show us this beautiful boy looking down in a very pensive, melancholy way. It's the look of death, because they were all statues that were actually created after his death.
That's what I was always looking through for during my first trip in Europe, and I was even talking with Guia and Villa Albani, because there's another famous portrait of Antinous in the villa. But
one of the best is in Delphi in Greece. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
No.
Yeah, in Delphi, in the Museum of Delphi, there is a beautiful statue of Antinous that was found in the, and I think that is one of the most, one of the most vivid portraits.
My goodness, yeah. There's an enormous stuff. Even I forgot to talk to you about the Empire in Conflict, this wonderful exhibit in the British Museum that they did. And they haven't done many recently, but that one was about 10 years ago. But it was really, really interesting, also saying things about the argument of the Pantheon itself. Maybe it was a kind of throne room for Hadrian. I thought it was fascinating. May not be true. They're doing a new one about Nero.
I don't believe that very much.
No. Well, but they're doing the British Museum right now is doing an exhibit about Nero, apparently, that's going to be coming out soon. So I'll be interested, because they started to become very, very commercial in the last exhibits that I saw. So I don't know. I'll be curious to see what they'll say and what they'll say about the Domus Aurea. But that's for another time. I do want to thank you again, Luca. It was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, because I know that you're working a lot on your archaeological digs, and your sketches of what you find after you work on the dig itself. So you're trying to do that now. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for this very, very lovely chat.
Okay, ciao, Luca.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to our TE Talks with Guides. We have a new episode every Wednesday. Please subscribe to get an alert when each podcast comes out. Rate us and tell people how you enjoyed it, and share it on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Most importantly, if you enjoyed it, send us a feedback about the show. Also, if you are curious about what some of these people and places we talked about look like, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch the video on this podcast, where we have inserted special images for you to further enjoy the story.